There are tractors that get bought to work, and there are tractors that get bought to die. Most people in the trade can tell the difference before they lift the hood. You look at the sheet metal, you check the hours on the meter, you listen to the engine idle for 30 seconds, and you already know this machine has either been respected or it hasn't. When Dale Whitmore drove 2 hours down a gravel county road to look at a 1984 Massey Ferguson 2680, he wasn't looking for a working tractor. He was looking for parts, a front axle assembly, a set of rear wheel hubs, whatever hydraulic components might still be serviceable off a machine the seller described, in his own words, as not worth the diesel to move it. The asking price was $600. Dale paid $550. He loaded it on a flatbed trailer in the rain, drove home in the dark, and backed the thing into his machine shed without starting it. His plan: pull the transmission, strip what he needed off the rear end, scrap the rest by the end of the month. That was a Wednesday. By the following Tuesday, everything had changed. Not because of what the tractor could do, because of what Dale found when he started pulling it apart, tucked inside the gearbox housing, sealed behind a plate, bolted down with a torque pattern no factory manual had ever specified. He found a history, and that history belonged to a machine that should not have existed in the condition it was in, because somebody had spent serious money making sure it ran exactly the way it wasn't supposed to. The question wasn't whether the Massey Ferguson was worth saving. The question was, who had already saved it once, and why did they let it go? The 1984 Massey Ferguson 2680 was not a glamorous machine, a workhorse in the truest sense. High horsepower row crop, rated at 160 from the factory, a Perkins A6 .354 diesel under the cowl, and a 12x4 partial power shift transmission. It was not exotic. It was not rare. It was exactly the kind of tractor that showed up in machinery lots across the grain belt through the late 1980s as the farms that had bought them new began to trade up. The one Dale bought had 11,400 hours on the meter. At that mileage on a working tractor from that generation, you expect worn bushings in the front axle, slop in the steering, hydraulics that are slow to respond. You expect the engine to start mostly, but to smoke on cold mornings. What Dale was not expecting was for the tractor to start on the first try. He hadn't planned on starting it, but when he climbed into the cab to release the parking brake, the key was in the ignition. Out of habit, he turned it. The glow light cycled. He turned it the rest of the way. The engine caught on the first compression stroke. Not a struggle. Not the labored startup of a neglected diesel that's been sitting since last fall. A clean, low-rev idle. Oil pressure up inside 4 seconds. Dale sat in the cab longer than he planned. Everything that was supposed to read something was reading something. The hydraulic charge light was off. He shut it down and walked around the machine more slowly. The bodywork was rough. The cab glass had a crack in the rear window. The exhaust stack had been replaced with an aftermarket unit that was slightly wrong. The rear tires were unmatched. Different brands, different tread depths, the pairing of a tire that failed mid-season, and a replacement from whatever the dealer had in stock. But the paint on the front axle was different. Not faded different. A shade slightly warmer than the Massey red oxidized across the rest of the machine. Someone had pulled that front axle and put it back, and the quality of the repaint suggested something beyond a basic rebuild. That was the work of someone who cared. The front axle came off first. The kingpins were new. The wheel bearing cups were new. The axle pivot bushings had been replaced with aftermarket items of noticeably better quality than original equipment. Whoever had done this rebuild had not been shopping by price. He set the axle aside, moved to the rear of the tractor, and began removing the access panels on the transmission housing. That is when things stopped being ordinary. When Dale pulled the second access panel on the transmission housing, held by 6 bolts, he found something that did not belong there. Folded twice and sealed inside a Ziploc bag taped flat against the back face of the panel, a set of handwritten service records. 4 pages, front and back, tight methodical script, dated entries running from 1991 through 2003, and tucked behind them, a machining specification sheet typed on a typewriter, measurements annotated in pen. Dale sat down on the shop floor and read. The first page covered the engine. The Perkins A6354 from the factory had been replaced in 1993, but not with a standard rebuild. The notes described the replacement as assembled with oversized pistons, a reground crankshaft, and a fuel injection pump recalibrated to a higher delivery rate. The annotation read, approximately 185 bhp at PTO, unverified. The factory rating had been 160. 25 additional horsepower represented a meaningful increase in both capability and in the stress placed on everything downstream. The second page covered the transmission, rebuilt in 1997. Clutch packs replaced with heavy-duty aftermarket units, shift forks machined. The input shaft replaced with what the notes called a custom-turned shaft, spec unknown, source direct. That phrase sat on the page without explanation. The third page covered the hydraulic system, rebuilt, high-volume pump replacing the original, system pressure raised beyond factory specification. A single line near the bottom, underlined twice, do not sell without disclosure, hours are accurate, power is not factory. The fourth page described work history in terms of specific tasks. Competition pulling, 3 events across 3 years, locations deliberately obscured. The machine had not placed in any of them. The notes described mechanical failures at each event, a clutch pack failure, a hydraulic line rupture, an unexplained loss of power. And they described the repairs. The final lines, power still exceeds factory, machine is sound, sell when appropriate. Dale read it twice, then a third time. He was not a man easily surprised by machinery. What surprised him was not the modifications. What surprised him was the condition of the machine at 11,000 hours, with an engine running at meaningfully higher output than designed for, with a transmission stressed by competition pulls and years of elevated horsepower fieldwork. The machine had started on the first key turn and idled clean. That did not happen by accident. That happened because someone had paid very close attention to this tractor for a very long time. Dale put the records in his shirt pocket, looked at the tractor, and called his brother. Dale's brother was a machinist, 31 years in a production shop handling agricultural and industrial components. He knew tolerances. When Dale read him the figures from the specification sheet, his brother was quiet for longer than Dale expected. The spec sheet had the look of a professional document, column formatting deliberate, measurements in both imperial and metric. The tolerances listed for the crankshaft journals were tighter than factory specification by a margin Dale could not quantify, but that his brother recognized immediately. That's race spec, his brother said. Not agricultural race spec, actual engine race spec. You don't need tolerances like that for a pulling tractor. You need them if you're building something that has to hold together under sustained high-speed load. Dale asked what that meant in practical terms. It means that engine wasn't built to pull. It was built to run, long, hard, without coming apart. The distinction matters. In tractor pulling, the goal is peak torque over a very short duration. You build the engine to survive the pull, not necessarily to survive 10,000 hours of field work afterward. The engine in Dale's tractor had been built to survive both. That was not common. It was not inexpensive. The machining shop, identified only by surname in the records, led Dale to a retired machinist's son, now running the same shop. When Dale described the specification sheet and read the surname, the son said, "That's my father's work. He only did 3 or 4 Massey builds. He was particular about them." His father had built competition engines for a small number of clients in the region during the late 1980s and early 1990s, a side practice born from genuine interest and skill, working specifically with Perkins 6-cylinder units, perhaps 6 or 7 engines over a decade, and charging considerably less than a professional builder would have because the money was not the point. He just liked to see what the engines could do, and he liked them to last. He couldn't stand building something that fell apart. Dale asked if his father knew anything about the specific tractor. The son was quiet. Then, "I can tell you, if my father built that engine, it's sound. Whatever hours are on it." Dale hung up and sat with that. A tractor in his machine shed, built by a careful man who liked things to last, designed to exceed the factory limits, and then to survive those exceedances across the full working life of the machine. It had been run in competition and found wanting. Returned to field work for years more. Sold for $550 to a man who planned to scrap it. The engine was sound. There is a particular embarrassment that lives in the agricultural community and rarely surfaces anywhere else. The embarrassment of having sold something for less than it was worth, not because you were cheated, but because you didn't know what you had. The man who sold the tractor to Dale was not a fool. A working farmer, large operation, tight cash position. He had acquired the 2680 as part of a larger estate lot 3 years earlier, kept the machines he needed, and let the rest sit. He had never opened the service panels. He had no reason to. When Dale called him after learning what was in those records, the man on the other end was silent before he spoke. "How much you think it's worth?" he asked. Dale thought about how to answer honestly. The modifications were real, but unverified in the sense that no dynamometer had measured the output of the engine under Dale's ownership. The service records were credible. The machinist's son's recollection was credible. The machine had started clean, but credible is not the same as certified, and in the machinery market, the gap between those two is where value lives or dies. "I don't know exactly," Dale said, "but it's not a scrap machine." The seller was quiet. Then, "I paid $2,000 for the whole lot." That was the full measure of it. A man had paid $2,000 for 5 tractors, kept 3, and sold one of the remainder for $550 to get it off the lot. He had looked at the outside and made a reasonable judgment. The machine had given him no reason to look further. But the machine had a history the outside did not show. Dale did not rub it in. He offered to share copies of the documentation. The seller thanked him. They ended the call without rancor. What Dale was left with was a decision. The tractor could still be a parts machine if he chose. The front axle was already off. He could strip the hydraulics, sell the engine to someone who would understand what they were getting. That was financially rational, the most practical path, given he had no immediate use for a tractor of that size. But there was something else. The tractor had been built by someone who cared, deliberately, with skill and patience. Built to last, and it had lasted. Run hard, and it had held together. Passed through hands that did not know its worth, and ended up on a flatbed headed for the scrap rate. And somewhere in the distance between what it was and what it looked like, there was a gap that felt like a waste the agricultural world could not afford. He made a decision he could not fully justify on paper. He was going to put the tractor back together. The decision to restore the 2680 looked cleaner in the moment than in the weeks that followed. The first problem was the transmission. The heavy-duty clutch pack assemblies from the 1997 rebuild had done their job, but material thickness was within a few thousandths of the minimum specification. Running them further under load was a risk a careful rebuild did not accept. Replacement components existed through standard channels. The problem was that the specific heavy-duty aftermarket units originally installed were no longer manufactured. That supplier had been acquired, the product line rationalized, and the components were simply gone from the supply chain. Dale spent 3 weeks looking for old stock. 4 states, multiple forums, a dealer in Canada who specialized in Massey Ferguson parts. Nothing. The second problem arrived while he was still working on the first. He sent the fuel injection pump to a diesel injection specialist. The specialist called back after a week. The pump was functional. The calibrations still close, but internal wear on the delivery valves and plunger barrel assemblies had reached a point where sustained heavy load would not be reliable. A rebuild was possible, but the required parts were also gone from standard channels. Dale sat in his shed on a Saturday with a partially disassembled tractor, 2 unsolvable parts problems, and a mounting awareness that his decision had cost him real money, real time, and a working front axle no longer available to the machine he had meant to use it on. This is the part of the story that does not get told often because it is not dramatic in the conventional sense. Nobody lost a farm over it. No auction, no creditor, no public humiliation. Just the slow realization that doing the right thing by a piece of machinery ran directly into the practical reality that the agricultural parts supply chain does not keep pace with the intentions of careful people. The tractor had been built to a standard the market no longer supported. Dale called his brother again. His brother said, "Send me the dimensions." The clutch pack friction material, in the specific thickness and diameter required, turned out to be available through an industrial supplier serving heavy equipment and marine diesel. Not identical to the original component. Better, harder wearing, rated for higher operating temperatures. It required a small amount of machining to fit the existing retaining plates. Dale's brother did that work himself. The injection pump proved more difficult. What solved it was an online auction, a lot of old agricultural service parts from a retired diesel shop in the upper Midwest, listed without much description, bought by Dale on a hunch for $62. Inside, 3 sets of delivery valve components in new old stock condition from a supplier out of business since 1994. 2 sets were the wrong size. The third was exactly right. Dale put the tractor back together over a month of evenings and weekends in a shed that got cold in November and colder in December. Where the service records noted a setting, he matched it. Where he deviated, he documented the deviation in his own handwriting and added the page to the original records. On a Thursday in January, he started the tractor in the shed. Clean idle, oil pressure up fast. He drove it out into the cold yard until the transmission temperature came to range. Everything worked. Everything worked the way someone had built it to work. 20 years and 2 owners before Dale had bought it for $550 to tear it apart. The 2680 went to work in the spring. Dale was not expecting to learn anything particularly new. He planned to confirm what the service records and his rebuild had suggested, that the machine was sound and capable. The first thing he learned was about the power. The service records notation, approximately 185 bhp at PTO, unverified, was honest about its uncertainty. In the field, the number that mattered was not the figure itself, but what the machine could pull without laboring, at what ground speed, under what soil conditions. The answer was more than the factory rating would have predicted. Not dramatically more. This was not a machine transformed into something unrecognizable. But the reserve power it showed under heavy draft load was consistently beyond what Dale's experience with factory-rated 2680s would have suggested. On his heaviest tillage passes, in conditions that would have pushed a standard example of that model harder, the 2680 pulled with an ease not explainable by the nameplate number. A working farmer feels it in the way a tractor responds when the ground changes, when the soil gets heavier, when the speed holds steady instead of dropping. His neighbor noticed. A John Deere man for 30 years, brand loyalty built not from marketing but from genuine experience. He came over one afternoon in June and stood at the fence watching. When Dale came past on the headland turn, the neighbor called out to ask what he was running. Dale told him. The neighbor was quiet. Then, "That's not running like a 2680. Dale explained, as much as was useful at the fence line, that the machine had been modified and the modifications had been done well. The neighbor nodded. He did not say much after that, but he remembered. The following winter, when Dale mentioned the 2680 had covered the full season without a single mechanical issue, no hydraulic failures, no clutch complaints, no injection symptoms, the neighbor's silence on the subject had a different quality than it had at the beginning. That is the understated part of this story that matters most. The tractor did not make the front page. It did not win a competition or establish a record. It worked. It worked the way that something carefully built tends to work, without drama, without breakdown. Season after season, in the way the man who built the engine intended when he set those tolerances and sealed the documentation inside a panel where only someone pulling the machine apart would ever find it. There is a question that runs through agricultural equipment culture that does not always get answered cleanly. What is a machine worth? The market answer is what someone will pay. The working answer is what it can do and for how long. The careful answer accounts for the knowledge that went into building it, the intention behind that knowledge, and the degree to which the machine continues to honor that intention across time and ownership. By the market answer, the 2680 was worth $550. By the working answer, considerably more. By the careful answer, Its worth was tied to something no transaction could capture. A man who knew engines chose to build one right, not because the economics required it, but because he liked to see what things could do when they were done correctly. And that choice, made in a machine shop in the early 1990s, was still present in the iron of a tractor bought for scrap 3 decades later. In the agricultural machinery world, decisions are made by the numbers: hours on the meter, asking price, horsepower rating, model year, condition grade. These variables assembled into a judgment, and the judgment is usually good enough. Most machines are what they appear to be. Most hours tell the truth. But every once in a long while, a machine carries something the numbers do not capture. Something that lives in the tolerances of a crankshaft journal, in the specification of a clutch pack material, in service records folded into a Ziploc bag and sealed behind a panel nobody thought to open for 30 years. The man who built that engine is gone now. He died in the late 2000s without particular fanfare, not famous in the agricultural world, not known outside his region. 6 or 7 engines over a decade as a side practice born from genuine interest. His name appears in no catalog or directory. What he left behind was a piece of iron that could still do the work, 20+ years after he last touched it, because he had chosen, in the privacy of his own shop, to do it right when doing it adequately would have been enough. He set tolerances the application didn't strictly require. He specified materials the budget didn't demand. He wrote it all down and sealed it inside the machine, not as a message, not as a legacy, but because that is what careful people do with information they believe might matter someday. Dale's neighbor stopped at the machine shed door the evening Dale told him the full story. He looked back at the tractor one last time. Whoever built that engine, he said, knew what they were doing. Dale agreed. That was all. Dale Whitmore bought a tractor for $550 to tear it apart for parts. What he found inside was the record of someone else's standards, and the evidence that those standards had been worth keeping. The service records are in a drawer in his house. He has added pages to them, his own notes in his own hand, in the same careful script as the original entries, not because anyone asked, not because anyone will come looking. Because that is what you do when someone hands you something that was built right. You try to be worth it.